everyone. My name is Dave Miller. I'm a licensed therapist in the state of Georgia with a master's in theological studies from Emory University, author of Christian Tantric Meditation Guide, which is available at Amazon.com. My website is www.sacredbreeze.org, where I provide online mindfulness meditation classes, spiritual discernment sessions one-on-one, and support for inclusive faith communities. Until recently, I've been working as Director of Spiritual Discernment for an addiction detox program in the North Georgia mountains. I've been in conversation with integral theory adherents for over 2 decades now. In my piece of the conversation, I'll be discussing how faith and spirituality interplay with the familiar state stages model in the real world. I'll also discuss a creative, dynamic way of interpreting spirituality. Now, with regard to stages of faith, we're familiar with the list: magical, mythical, conventional, pluralistic, and nondual. Very similar to Fowler's stages of faith with a couple subtle differences. Fowler's model speaks more, I think, to personal struggle and growth, while the integral model speaks to something a bit more systemic and societal. One of the things I've noticed in my own practice as spiritual director is that movement from one stage to another is often the result of a crisis of faith. For example, if someone experiences a loss and then realizes that magical, mythical, or conventional thinking was not able to prevent the loss or to mitigate the resulting grief, suffering as a result of grief, a new way of interpreting life's challenges is required. With this in mind, consider the phenomenon of the prosperity gospel that happened in Christianity back in the 90s. Remember that? The prayer of Jabez, purpose-driven life, megachurch promises of great wealth for the simple cost of a tithe or 1/10 of one's earnings. These were all part of the Christian faith culture at the time. The mood was a bit magical, a bit mythical, a bit conventional, and I would even say a bit pluralistic in the exploration of a different way of interpreting faith. Adherents were told if you only had enough faith, success would come. Then 9/11 happened, which quashed the idea that one could buy mythical protections. And a series of recessions took away the hope of long-term prosperity for many. Many who bought into the prosperity gospel worldview found themselves back stuck in the humus of our common origin, facing once again the existential human vulnerability in health, safety, and economic security. As a result, many resorted to blame of other groups like gay people, Muslims, and immigrants. We also saw a retrenchment into more primitive fundamentalist views, modes of thinking, i.e. calling on a mythical hero god to thwart our enemies. This retrenchment was not limited to Western Christian traditions. Fundamentalist groups in Islam, Hinduism, and even Judaism and Buddhism joined Christians in acts of prejudice and violence against each other. While many reacted with regressive retrenchment to prior stages, some more progressive pluralistic groups discussed the idea of no control as a norm worth accepting. Well, maybe. Remember when the CIA hired psychologists to come up with a way of utterly breaking down the human psyche for the purpose of gaining information? They did this by systematically tearing away all sense of self-control, self-advocacy, and hope for any meaningful future. Clearly, while acceptance of no control offers some insight into the existential human condition, it's a bitter drink that can be hard to swallow without being lost completely. So with some of this history in mind, let's go back to the models. On the surface, integral models might be misinterpreted to suggest a huge leap from pluralistic exploration to a sort of universal I'm okay, you're okay, love your neighbor way of thinking. Even Fowler expected a leap in which personal awakening would save the day, both in young and in older adults, leading the way to universal love. Looking at the expectations and the realities, we're left with a question: where was this magical burst of wisdom that was supposed to pull people forward into a new realization? Well, perhaps there is still a small voice buried in the relative noise of retrenchment, and it still has the potential to emerge, perhaps not along the straight line path to non-dual enlightenment that many anticipated. One might call a stage between pluralism and universal non-dual acceptance as recapitulation, and that's the term I'm going to be using for that, recapitulation. But before we talk about recapitulation, let's go back to pluralism for a moment, which some interpret as abandoning tradition and seeking other. Again, often as a result of perceived crisis. When the old model doesn't work in a new situation, look for a new model that fits. For some, the new models were explored were other traditions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, Jewish mysticism, Islam, neo-pagan faith practices, and even integral philosophy. Another very real manifestation of pluralistic exploration was and is substance-based, with artificially induced bursts of inspiration and experience stimulating neuroreceptors in ways similar to what is often described as ecstatic or enlightened spiritual experience. Regardless of the escape being explored, it eventually becomes apparent that the high was never high enough. A state of nirvana remains elusive, and it might be found that even other practices don't provide magical answers to the humus of existence. Retrenchment is not restricted to conventional expressions of faith. Retrenchment happens among pluralists as well. There's a lot of talk in the community about social justice warriors and green meanies, or pluralists with an agenda that rejects expressions of personal, cultural, and political identity that do not align well with what have ironically been established as pluralistic norms. Perhaps in reaction to the green meanies, there's also arisen a movement that some describe as blue meanies, who support the reinforcement of traditional ethnic, cultural, and socio-political boundaries, often to the exclusion of others who have already settled into those traditional boundaries. In our integral communities, we can often see volleys of sarcasm and insult being lobbed between the blue and the green encampments, echoing the larger socio-political breakdown and conflict growing worldwide. Throw in the fear and uncertainty of a worldwide pandemic, and where is this all going? With all this in mind, it's a good time to discuss the idea of recapitulation, which is actually part of the integral philosophy. Unlike retrenchment, recapitulation is not an affirmation of regressive modes of interpretation, but an affirmation of the value that origin cultures and faiths hold. For example, for many people, attending Mass brings a sense of comfort and security. There's value in that alone. Reading Psalms and Proverbs, retelling the old stories, attending churches, synagogue, mosque, and temple. Attending to the offices as contemplative Christians and praying at regular intervals as observant Muslims. These practices add structure, comfort, security, and meaning to life. And it's not necessary to attach a far future magical outcome to these practices. They have value unto themselves, here and now. This is where the maturity and lessons learned from previous stages comes in revisiting and assimilating practices with maturity and wisdom. And speaking of addiction, this is where lessons learned from the recovery community provide helpful guidance. Life is lived one day at a time, and self-care, including spiritual self-care, is an important part of healthy and happy living. Self-care does not magically remove the human condition, but it does provide comfort and inspiration to live life one day at a time. A necessary part of recapitulation is acceptance. The word humanity has at its root humus, or earth. Acceptance of the human condition includes acceptance of our mortality and the realization that it is possible to have some limited control in life, just for today. We can choose to participate in community, in faith, and in practice for the mutual benefit of reassurance, comfort, and inspiration to move forward into another day and then into another. Recapitulation need not even be into one's family of origin, cultural territory, though it can be. Recapitulation can incorporate lessons learned from pluralistic exploration. Recapitulation can even be in reaction against familiar cultural norms, settling into a completely other faith and tradition. For example, when pressed, I describe myself as a Budeo-Christian, and I treasure and I participate in the teachings and learnings from both traditions, Buddhism and Christianity. Whether practicing tradition of origin, a completely other tradition, or a fusion of some sort, recapitulation involves an acceptance of self as human in a realistic way, and a realistic adoption of practice that brings comfort and inspiration in realistic ways. So with that said, the word inspiration provides an entree into the next subject I'd like to discuss, which is the creative dynamic nature of spirituality. In many languages outside of English, the word spirit also describes breath and breeze, or some form of dynamic energy. Ruach in Hebrew, pneuma in Greek, prana in Sanskrit, lung in Tibetan are just a few of the words describing breath, breeze, and spirit, while qi in Chinese and ki in Japanese describe vital energy. In Christian scripture, Jesus says the Spirit is like the wind, coming and going as she pleases. We cannot hear her, but we can feel her presence by her dynamic motion, not as a static presence. In both Western and Eastern traditions, it may seem that the goal of faith and practice is a static stage or state of enlightenment, nirvana or heaven. Remember the book of Tom Sawyer? Remember how Tom reacted when his Aunt Polly described heaven as a place where people sit around on clouds and play harps all day and night? Tom said he might prefer the other place because heaven sounded pretty boring. Even in integral thought, the idea of the hive mind can seem more like a nightmare than a movement towards a dynamic, truly non-dual mode of existence. What might a more dynamic existence look like? One dimension often sadly neglected by both Western and Eastern traditions is creativity. It seems the very word tradition discourages creative exploration. Usually adherents are asked to cling to an established set of texts and ideas, or the interpretations of this guru or that, with little allowance for creative exploration or variance. If an exploration is to occur, it must wait until a person reaches the age of the old gurus and preachers and imams, who are the presumptive guardians of the traditions. And yet creativity persists. What if creative dynamic were the goal rather than reaching some static stage of awareness? Even from the integral perspective, transcendent include is often described as a process, but not really explored as a practice. Transcendence can imply a sort of quaint acknowledgement and, to be honest, an arrogant dismissal of prior stages. I want to repeat this for emphasis. Transcendence can imply a quaint acknowledgement and arrogant dismissal of prior stages. This sounds kind of mean and green, doesn't it? The word transcendence can leave the impression that the doorway is one way only, without any option or even motivation to dynamically exist and move freely within the stages. And by the way, this realization that enlightenment might be more than a one-way ticket from samsara to nirvana was part of the Buddhist movement from Theravada to Mahayana thinking tradition. Dynamic spirit inspires movement, motion, creative expression and social communion, communication and sharing. Dynamic spirit acknowledges both transcendent possibility and grounded reality, which act as poles through which the current of creativity flows. Dynamic spirit acknowledges the non-dual coexistence of and movement within multiple stages, as opposed to a one-way ticket to heaven, which can turn into a static hell. The last season of the TV show The Good Place did an excellent job of illustrating how a static heaven can feel like an eternal hell. Dynamic spirit brings us back to recapitulation, which implies a dynamic motion that can include participation in prior stages, prior stage rituals, and traditions. Recapitulation also includes realistic acceptance of the human condition, which motivates engagement in transcendent creativity. Using psychological attachment theory language, secure attachment experience during childhood development provides a safe foundation for exploring in creative expression. Recapitulation can also help form and reinforce a comfortable foundation from which to launch creative engagement. Once recapitulation reaches a point of secure maturity, which is self-aware and accepting of both human limitations and transcendent creative potential, next stage non-dual engagement is more easily realized. Having explored other and self and accepted self, a new dimension is added to the sacred creative flow. And the sacred flow is not limited to personal experience and achievement. The sacred flow is shared with others in the community in capacities both intimate and social, personal and cultural. So to summarize, the movement from pluralism to subsequent stages has for many manifested as a cliff, often resulting in a general retreat and retrenchment in fear. Additionally, the lack of adequate attention to dynamic flow as part of the developmental process neglects true creative and social engagement. This lack of flow makes the path forward even more of a cliff, without the benefit of a bridge over which to pass back and forth freely. And of course, the bridge I'm describing is recapitulation, which provides an affirmation of engagement in tradition and faith from a non-dual perspective of both grounded wisdom and experience, and also provides creative inspiration for free movement throughout the stages, creatively, developmentally, and socially.